You are listening to the Prepared Warrior Podcast, where law enforcement and military trainers discuss cutting-edge training, tactics, and technology. Here is your host, John Wilson.
Welcome to Season 2, Episode 6 of the Prepared Warrior Podcast. I'm John Wilson. Our guest for this episode is Dr. Sarah Dentry-Travis. I like to start every episode with a quote. This one is from Max Lerner, who said, "The turning point in the process of growing up is when you discover the core of strength within you that survives all hurt." Our special guest today is Dr. Sarah Dentry-Travis. She is a human performance consultant and conducts research into the mechanisms of mental and physical toughness in extreme environments, specifically in military, police, and emergency first responder populations. She has skied to the North Pole and climbed the highest mountain in Antarctica to measure human performance in challenging environments. Dr. Dentry-Travis investigates the psychological, biological, and physiological components that enable a person to thrive in stressful, high-intensity situations and continuously perform at their peak level. Prior to immersing herself in research and human performance consultancy, she served 10 years in the Canadian Armed Forces with deployment. She is a biathlete and was selected to represent Canada at the Invictus Games in the sport of archery recurve. She is a member of the International Association of Law Enforcement Intelligence Analysts, Inc. Thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me.
So first, I wanted to ask, what got you interested in researching human reactions to high-stress situations?
Yeah, so as you said, I served 10 years in the military with deployment, and I saw firsthand how people react differently to stress. Some people, even though they're exposed to the same thing, some people will succumb to the stress, and some people seem to thrive in the situations. And but it wasn't until I got involved with a program called Outward Bound Veterans that I started to actually take a deeper interest in it and actually want to start researching it. In 2014, I was invited to be on the soldier team with True Patriot Love Foundation to ski to the North Pole. Mm-hmm. And when I got selected to do that, I thought, well, this would be a perfect opportunity to actually collect data, research data, on how everyone's dealing with the different challenges that they might encounter while on this expedition. And on that expedition, we had 12 military personnel who either had mental or physical injuries, as well as about 30 some odd civilians who did not have mental or physical injuries. And so it created a perfect example, perfect research group to collect data on this.
Right. So you had a very tight control group of military experienced and then civilian as well as injured and non-injured. So you could have all those different factors to work from.
Yeah, and the beauty of doing research on expeditions, as psychologists, we like to do things in labs because we can control everything to the nth degree. But the problem with doing things in labs is your participants come in for an hour or 3 hours, but you have no control over what they were doing before they came into the lab. And you have no control over what they do once they leave the lab. But on an expedition, everyone is in the exact same boat. Everyone's eating the same things. They're all sleeping the same way. They're dealing with the exact same environment during the night, and they're dealing with the same people. So you have all these controls, even though they're out of your control. Everyone's dealing with the exact same scenario. So you have a sort of control on these expeditions.
So from your research that you gathered on that expedition, what would you say or what did you notice are some of the factors that lead people to perform well under high stress conditions?
So one of the main things that I found was I'm a psychoneuroendocrinologist, so that's a big word, but break it down, and it looks at your psychology, your endocrine system, and your neurology. So your psychology is how you perceive something. Your neurology is how your brain interprets that and triggers different mechanisms. And then your endocrine system is your hormones and such that then control your different organs and your responses. So there's the psychoneuroendocrine system, but then the main thing that I'm interested in is the perception. How are people perceiving the challenge? And your perception of control in these difficult situations is what triggers different responses in your body. So two people can have the same stressor. You have two people jumping out of a plane, for instance. One person could perceive this as an exhilarating, fun thing to do. Another person could perceive it as they're going to die, right? It's the exact same situation, but it's a completely different response that's going to be triggered. And it all comes down to how they're perceiving that activity. So that was the main thing that I found, was how people perceived the situation. And one other thing that is of note is how people have been raised. And I like to use an example of dandelions and orchids. So we have orchids, the plant, right? And you grow them in a perfect environment. You have perfect soil for them. You have them on a shelf in the right environment with the right amount of sunlight and everything, and they'll grow and bloom to be a beautiful plant, right? And everyone oohs and ahs over orchids. Yeah. But you take an orchid and you move it into a different spot, even just slightly different, it might have a tiny bit of a draft, the orchid will die, right? And it's the same in society. We have certain people that, their parents were able to pay their way through university. They didn't have to have jobs or anything while they went to university. The parents paid for private tuition, private lessons, paid for the best books, best schools, and everything. And then these people end up going to Ivy League universities, get these wonderful degrees, and everyone thinks these are the elite of society. But they've never actually had to deal with any type of adversity. Now, dandelions, on the other hand, it's a weed. We try to kill it. We're always spraying it, and it just keeps on blooming. It keeps on coming up through the cracks. It grows through concrete. And the fact that it can grow through concrete makes dandelions more robust, more resilient. And it's the same with people, too. The ones that are coming up through adversity, who've had to fight and if they went through university and they had 3 jobs in order to do it, they may get C's and B's as grades, but the fact is they're going to be more resilient people and able to deal with stress at the end of the day versus the ones who got an A+ at an Ivy League college because they've had all the things their way has been paved for them versus the ones who've had to fight. So the ones that have had to really deal with all these adverse conditions, they're going to be more resilient people in the long run.
I see. So the kind of street smarts, people learn from dealing with tougher situations when they're younger, may be able to better handle tougher situations when they're older. Is that sort of a general? To an extent.
Yeah. Another thing with adverse childhood treatment is that it can actually be a precursor for PTSD. Right. So when you're young and you have child abuse and such, that will not necessarily make you more resilient in the future. It could actually go against you. It's more of when you've developed and you've become an adult, and then you have been able to deal with all these adversities, and that helps you develop more resiliency.
So people who have post-traumatic stress disorder or have experienced some kind of trauma when they're younger, are they still able to function in high stress situations, or what have you found in that regard?
Yeah, well, when we went to the North Pole and we went to Antarctica, the soldier groups, some of them had mental health injuries and some of them had physical injuries. And some of the ones with the mental health injuries had PTSD. They were still able to meet the goals. They were still able to do these profound expeditions. They were able to ski to the North Pole. They were able to climb the highest mountain in Antarctica. It didn't stop them from being able to do these extreme events. The thing with PTSD is it causes when people encounter triggers that remind them of their trauma. That's where there's an issue. But there's treatments that they can take, like cognitive behavior therapy, which basically teaches them to rethink how their emotions are dealing with the situation, and to recreate that perception. So instead of always thinking that this trigger, which is similar to their trauma, it's bad, they can actually kind of have an internal dialogue and say, well, no, this is not going to actually kill me. This isn't actually going to be bad. My emotions are not being true in this situation. So that's what CBT teaches them to do. And CBT has been, cognitive behavior therapy, has been shown to be the most effective therapy or treatment for PTSD, even more so than any type of pharmaceuticals that they could take. So there is treatments for PTSD. Once a person develops it, it's not like as if they're going to have it forever. There's the possibility for them to get better.
And then they could still, perform in a high stress situation as long as they're just able to manage symptoms or the triggers.
Yeah. Because once again, it's all about the perception, right? It's you perceive the trigger, and they automatically, when they have PTSD and they're not having treatment, they automatically think this thing is going to kill me. This thing is a threat, right? And it's hypervigilance or avoidance behavior, and they'll immediately react in a negative way. But CBT teaches them to re-perceive or perceive it in a different way and teach them that's not actually a threat.
So moving over to law enforcement, how do you think law enforcement officers or trainers could benefit from your kind of research?
So my research, I focus on the proactive aspects of stress, for dealing with stress. So instead of waiting for people to break from the challenges and demands of their jobs, I look for ways to help them bolster their internal resources, to help them to help make them stronger and more effective. So when we focus on providing resources for personnel while they're still healthy, we could keep them on the job. We could keep their relationships together. Because once people break and they may have PTSD or depression or anxiety as a result of having the chronic stress from their job, what we find is they can no longer do their job, and their family situations break down. And once the family situations break down, it gets even worse, because families are such an important part for resources for the personnel, right, to deal with their job and deal with the stress and such. So my research takes a macro approach. I don't focus on just one aspect. There's some researchers who do, but I like to look at how social issues, psychological issues, as well as neurological issues, the endocrine system, your biology, your physiology, nutrition, sleep, how all of it impacts your ability to deal with stress. And so once you start looking at how all of it works together and in conjunction with each other, you get a better understanding of how, if someone is not sleeping well, that's going to have an impact on how they're eating, right? Because they might just start binge eating or eating junk food. Eating junk food has a huge impact on your mood and your ability to handle stress. All these things are connected to each other. And so these are some of the things that I use. So as I mentioned, good nutrition is key. Proper sleep hygiene, and when I say proper sleep hygiene, I'm talking about the quality of sleep as well as the quantity of sleep. So making sure that you're getting that 8 hours of sleep a day, which is hard when you're a shift worker, which a lot of emergency personnel are.
Right.
But just making sure that you're getting those 8 hours. But not just getting the 8 hours, but getting a good 8 hours, right? Quantity and quality of sleep is very important. And physical fitness, staying in shape, doing good cardio a few times a week gives you a very strong foundation for dealing with stress. Working out provides you with feel-good hormones, and it helps balance your system, helps maintain your mood, and it helps you handle stress better. And then that sense of control. If you feel that you're in control of a situation, you're not going to feel as stressed. And then technical mastery. This was something key in Antarctica. Understanding your equipment is technical mastery. So if you're going to have to shoot a gun, you're a police officer and you have to shoot a gun, you have to make sure that you know how to operate your gun. You have to know that you're going to hit the target, right? A lot of people shoot guns, but they're not actually good at hitting targets. You have to know how to get it out of your holster effectively, right? Not be fumbling around. Or if you have to cuff a suspect and they're squirming around, you have to know how to work the cuffs effectively. Not being able to handle your own equipment, not understanding your equipment, causes stress. In Antarctica, there's one point in the climb where it was very steep and icy, and we had to rely on our crampons, which are the picks basically at the bottom of your boots that you put on certain parts of a mountain. And this part was very steep, but we weren't roped into the mountain, so we weren't anchored in with a rope. We were just free on the mountain, but we were roped in together with other people because we're on a glacier. So when you're moving on a glacier, you have to be roped into a rope team. And so the only thing holding us onto the mountain were our crampons on our feet. And some people on the team, this is for our summit day. So we'd already spent 9 days on this mountain getting to this point. And then now we're just getting our summit attempt. And everyone had made it to this point. There's so many other difficult parts of the climb. But this part where you just had to rely on your crampons, and people who weren't used to using crampons, it just seemed to get the psychological better of them. And so they gave up and turned around, and they didn't get to the summit. There's about 5 people on the team that didn't get to the summit because they just didn't have that sense of security, that they didn't feel that they were in control, right? Because they just didn't understand the crampons were making them uncomfortable. And so these are called crux points. It's a mountaineering term. It's a point on a climb where you feel you can't go on, and you feel you have to quit. It could be a geographical reason because it's like a physically impossible spot to get past because of some geographical aspect of the mountain. It could be the weather turned bad and you have to go back. Your equipment could have broken, or you don't have the right equipment to get past. There's a whole assortment of different reasons for crux points. But the one that I'm interested in is the psychological crux points, where you think that you can't get past it, but you actually can, right? And so I like to try to help people understand their psychological crux points and to help them get past those obstacles so they can still reach their goal, even though they think that they're at a point that they have to quit. Because a lot of times you still have a bit more in you to get past it.
And I could see that equipment being an issue for law enforcement too, if they're not comfortable using a baton or just maybe a pepper spray or something. They might go to a firearm or something because they're more comfortable with that, and in a stressful situation might make a decision based on just the comfort of the equipment.
Right.
So I guess it's important always for people to know all their options, and like you're saying on the mountain, yes, some people maybe just weren't comfortable with that, not having the rope at that time.
Yeah.
So what are the different effects we might see between stress that occurs over a long period of time, like your trek through Antarctica, versus short period sudden traumatic events?
Yeah, so acute versus chronic stress. Stress in general is not necessarily bad. Stress is there to keep us alive. It's an evolutionary thing. Every reaction that you have when you're stressed is there. It's built into you to keep you alive. It triggers your fight or flight response. And acute stress is actually helpful for your immune system. It bolsters your immune system. Chronic stress, however, is when you're constantly feeling stressed and you don't know how to cope with that. And so there's adaptive coping mechanisms and maladaptive coping mechanisms. And so when you have chronic stress and you don't have proper coping mechanisms, it will build up in your system. And then it can cause a whole plethora of different health problems. Things like decreased brain plasticity. So brain plasticity is your ability of your brain to change and adapt over time. Even as an adult, our brains are constantly changing. And you have decreased gray matter in your prefrontal cortex, which is your decision-making, your emotion regulation area. And it can also, other things like coronary heart disease. So chronic stress causes all these things. But the good news is, and it makes you age prematurely. The good news is, though, you just have to employ positive coping mechanisms, which could be very difficult to do. So some of the maladaptive coping mechanisms that people have for chronic stress would be things like trying to numb it by drinking lots of alcohol, doing drugs, engaging in risk-taking behavior like driving poorly or having aggression, road rage. These are all maladaptive coping mechanisms, or avoidance, not talking about it. Positive coping mechanisms would be like going to the gym, working out, talking to your friends about what you're feeling. And mindfulness and meditation, which seems very new age, but it actually is very beneficial for helping deal with stress. These are all positive coping mechanisms, but the number one is working out. That seems to be the best one for dealing with stress.
Working out, so just physically, is it to do with kind of blood flow as well as just mentally working towards something? Or
yeah, so when I say working out, there's 2 levels of working out. One is going to the gym and just working out, right. And that has positive things for your health. But the best one would be, the gold standard would be to work out in nature. So there was a study done where a university had got a bunch of students really tired with a bunch of mental math questions and such. And then they had the students go out and do a 50-minute walk. One was in an urban center and one group was sent to a park. And then they came back and had to do a bunch more of cognitive tests afterwards. And the ones that went out to the park with the trees and the grass and the plants, they were much better. They were statistically significantly better at doing the cognitive tasks afterwards than the ones who walked around in the urban center. They both did exercise. They both walked around for 50 minutes, but the ones that went out into nature actually had better cognitive performance. And so there's been a whole host of other studies that have looked at the whole benefits of being out in nature. You don't even have to work out in nature. You can just sit in nature and it will have a lot of benefits for dealing with stress, but it's even better if you work out in nature.
So if you go for a walk with your dog in the park, that's just like one of those things?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's all you need. Just go and take like 50 minutes after work, take your dog to the park, and as long as you're amongst trees and plants, then it's good for you. Kind of hard in Winnipeg in the winter, but
sure, yeah. Just got to layer up.
Yeah, exactly.
So you mentioned earlier you're interested in having people, push through intensity and stressful situations to perform at their peak. So I would say that's almost like a little different than just like handling stress well, but it's also performing, at the top level. So what is something that really helps people focus or perform well at their job, whether it's like, sports or law enforcement, when it's a kind of do or die situation, they got to make a quick decision?
Yeah, again, it comes back to that dandelion and orchids situation. The people that have been trained in these adverse conditions, you could have a nice cushiony life your whole life and then start training for adverse conditions, and you could build up that resiliency. We see ultra runners peaking in their 40s and 50s, where most other sports people are peaking in their late teens and 20s. The reason for ultra runners peaking late is it takes them that amount of time to start learning about their internal resources and what they can actually do and how to get over those mental blocks. When your brain is telling you, I'm tired, I want to stop, there's no more enjoyment in this. They've have personal experience to get past that. I like to call it like their personal toolbox, their personal internal resources for getting over all these obstacles. Because we constantly want to try to have a nice cushy life, right? But that causes us to not be able to meet certain goals when things get challenging. And so constantly trying to push yourself and put yourself in uncomfortable situations and learning from that. Stress and failure are so important for becoming more resilient and durable later on. You have to be open to failing and learning from it and trying again and then being successful. And that will allow you to be more resilient and durable.
Do you think some people are predisposed to better handle or perform under high stress, or do you think it's specifically a skill that's built up over time, whether it's from real life, experience or kind of training environments, or they're just some people who are just they're just able to handle things better?
Yeah. Well, there are genetic factors that contribute to whether a person's predisposed to certain stress and PTSD. There's even some research that has shown that PTSD could be passed on to the next generation even before they're born. So mothers who have experienced trauma, or women who have experienced trauma, and then subsequently get pregnant and have a child, that child could then be more predisposed to develop PTSD, even regardless of how they're brought up and such.
Right.
But it's your perception of the stress and challenge that determines how your brain's actually going to trigger the different chemical or hormonal cascade that you're going to experience. So if you encounter a stressor and you know from previous experience that you can survive it and maybe even thrive after it, you won't have the same debilitating reaction as you would if you perceive that stress might kill you. The key is to how you perceive that challenge. So like cognitive behavioral therapy, it's how you renegotiate that challenge or renegotiate what that challenge means to you. So it's a skill that's built up over time, but you have to actually be willing to experience adverse environments in order to actually become more resilient.
So what do you think about high stress training for like police and military as a way to help them for stress on the job? So for instance, where there's a pain penalty involved or some kind of perceived stress in a training environment, do you think that's a beneficial way to train?
Yeah, I'd say it's probably the only intelligent way to train for that type of a situation, because the only way that you know how you're going to react in those situations is if you have some sort of knowledge of it from before. And so building up that knowledge of how your body reacts to those types of situations and knowing that you can handle it will help you reduce your stress before going into another situation like that.
Is that a good way to kind of find your limit? Like, is there I guess limits to what people can take as far as working in intense environments?
Yeah, for sure. Not everyone can go all the way, right? Everyone has different limits. So that would be the safest way, right? Because if you're doing it in training and you find out, I really can't get past this for whatever reason, then you know that, you can't put yourself in those situations. And so then you could just perhaps have a occupation change,
right?
Or maybe not a total occupation change, but maybe a different role within the same occupation, right? Maybe not be the door kicker and such. Instead, do more of a assistant role or something. But
right.
Yeah.
What would you say is unique as far as what you've seen to the stress that is faced by law enforcement compared to some other high stress occupations you have studied?
So I've studied elite athletes, circus performers, the military, police, elite business people as well. They all experience extreme stress. They experience, disrupted sleep cycles, wonky nutrition, all these things. The thing that's the police and military, I find, are the closest amongst these groups.
Right.
But what's unique with the police, with the military, they are deployed to another area and they have to basically police a population in that other area. They have to deal with life and death situations where people are potentially trying to kill them and they're trying to protect a population. And the police have the similar sort of mandate, except they're doing it in their own backyard with their own neighbors and where their families live. And so for the police, they never get to switch off. They're constantly in that deployed state. So I find for the police, it tends to be a lot more intense for them. Also with the military, there's a tangible impression that society respects them and appreciates them. And the police don't necessarily get that because they are, again, policing their own society. So they get a lot of people not appreciating them and even hating them. And so that has an effect on how people can handle the stress of their job, right? You could do the job, but still feel that you're gaining ground and doing something right when you're in the military because society's saying, yes, we appreciate you. We're thankful for what you do. They go to Tim Hortons and people are buying you coffee. But with the police, it's not necessarily quite as obvious. So that has an impact on their resources, their ability to handle stress, unfortunately. So
you've talked a lot about how perception is important to the stress. So if someone is just perceiving a threat as something they can handle, is that kind of what you're saying? Like that's the big difference between I can't handle this threat or I can handle this threat, kind of a confidence over the situation? Yeah,
so a funny example that I could give about that, in Antarctica when we were in our rope teams and we're walking at a very slow pace because you're at high altitude, so the pace is extremely slow. And when you're on a glacial rope team, you have to maintain a certain distance and keep the rope between you and the person in front of you and behind you taut so that if you fall down into a crevasse, it's not going to ping everyone off. And so anyways, you have to maintain the exact same pace as the person in front of you. And that can be very wearing on, that was actually a main stressor of people on the expedition, was not being able to choose their own pace. They had to take a step when the person in front of them took a step. And so what people ended up doing in order to sort of regain control and deal with that stress, even though it's a minimal stress, that was they would take 3 fast steps, then they'd stop and wait until the rope gets tight again, and then they take 3 fast steps. So even though they're moving at the same pace, they felt that they were controlling their pace, and that helped them deal with the stress. So even though they weren't actually in control, they thought that they were in control. So it was a fake perception, but it was like a placebo, but it still caused them to feel that they were in control. Right? So just the perception of being in control, even if you're not in control, will help guard against different stress reactions as well.
So then, and it works the other way, right? I guess if an officer, it feels like they're not making the decisions, maybe with a partner, then they might feel like more stressed out about whether it's the right decision because they don't have control over it. Do you think? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. If you don't have control in the situation, then that's when you're going to just have a compounded stress effect.
Mm-hmm. So, what has your research led to? Kind of other recommendations of just like general for dealing with high stress? Is there any kind of future project you have for any kind of agency or anything that you're looking to help people improve their performance who work and live in these kind of conditions?
Yeah, I've worked with a couple of different rehab programs that deal with people who have PTSD, depression, anxiety, all the things that they develop after they've sort of broken and are no longer able to do their job, right? They're at home now 20 hours a day, sleeping, only getting up for 4 hours a day. And the different resources that we give those people would be teaching them about mindfulness, meditation, getting up and going for a jog or even just a walk if they can't jog out in the woods, and teaching them about good nutrition and all these things. And so what I'm trying to do is take all those resources and give them to people before they break. So proactively giving them these personal resources for dealing, because we know all these things help people deal with stress. Mm-hmm. So why are we waiting until people break before we give them these resources? We should be giving people these resources in order to help them be more effective, be more resilient, be more durable in their jobs. So yeah, the main things that the main take-home items would be good nutrition. Like science has shown that what you put in your stomach impacts your mood, impacts your ability for dealing with stress. If you're eating junk food, if you're eating McDonald's, and a lot of times when you're working shift work, that ends up being the only option, but just try to make a cautious effort to actually pack a lunch, a healthy lunch or dinner, whatever you want to call it at 2:00 in the morning. Yeah. To pack healthy meals so that you're more able to deal with the stress. Make sure that you're getting the right sleep, good sleep, having those social relations with other people, knowing that you can, lean on people and seeking help when you're feeling down. But physical activity is so important. And the physical activity also helps you learn about your ability to control situations, right? If you can go and run for 10 kilometers, like you may not be able to start on a 10-kilometer run, right? Start with 1 kilometer, then work up to 3, then 5 kilometers, 7, 10. Then next thing you know, you're doing a half marathon, and then you'll feel a bit more confident in other situations beyond running. And then also trying to expose yourself to new things that kind of scare you. Put yourself out there, realize that you actually have the tools to get past it, and then you'll be more confident in those situations.
What has been the response from agencies and people you've talked to and kind of told about your research? Groups like, I'm guessing you mentioned earlier you might talk to some firefighters later. So what is kind of the response you often get when you explain how they can handle these high stress parts of their life? Yeah,
they understand. Mm-hmm. They appreciate and they see the value of proactive resources and for trying to train for adverse challenges and such. And everyone wants to put those into action. The only problem usually is funding and time. Everyone's so busy, and especially with emergency first responders, with police, fire, paramedics, they're run off their feet all the time. Mm-hmm. And there's always cuts in city budgets, and they just don't have the funding to try to help their people. So people see the value of it, but they're not necessarily able to put it into play. So I try to spend a lot of my time doing ride-alongs and going and talking just pro bono and trying to get the information out to the user communities. I spend a good portion of my time doing that instead of writing research articles because the user communities don't necessarily go into university libraries and take out an academic journal and start trying to find an article that I wrote in that. Instead, I try to get out there and actually talk to them and teach them about the things that they can do to try to keep their resiliency and durability.
All right. Well, thanks again, Dr. Sarah Dentry-Travis, for coming on.
Thank you.
This has been the Prepared Warrior Podcast. For more info on our guests or other episodes, check out thepreparedwarrior.com. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for the Prepared Warrior Podcast, email jon@thepreparedwarrior.com.